Okay, well, in order to be mindful of time, I will get started, and then I'll just keep inviting people, adding people in as they arrive. Kia ora and welcome to everyone. Before we begin, I would like you to join me in karakia and then some waiata to set our intention of collegiality and respect, and also just so we can have a sing-song, because that's, what's wrong with that. So karakia, I've put in the chat. Oh, I've got two going in here. Oh, okay. That hopefully we can see. If you would like to join me, it's there in the chat. Easier than me trying to share it. So I'm trying to do three things once. Okay. Te tawa mai I runga, te tawa mai I raro, te tawa mai I rotu, te tawa mai I waho. Kia tawa ai ke te muritu, te Maori ora, ki te katoa, haume hui e tākie. Come forth from below, within, and from the environment. Vitality and well-being for all, strengthened in unity. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I could do a bit of vitality myself today. And then I thought we would sing Tu Te Ramai because it is lively and fun. And although Puriane is probably my favourite one from a real jamming point of view, I did think it was perhaps a little bit too slow for our purposes today. So we will go with the lively jam one. And I'm going to just share my screen and make it bigger. And feel free, please, to join.
Tu tira mai iwi, tātou e. Tu tira mai ngā iwi, tātou e. Whai a te maramatanga, me te aroha e ngā iwi kia tapatai ki a kotahira. Tātou e. Tu tira mai ngā iwi, tātou e. Tu tira mai ngā iwi, tātou e. Whai a te maramatanga, me te aroha e ngā iwi kia tapatahi ki a kotahira. Tātou e. Tātou e.
Kia ora, thank you everybody. I know you were all singing along even though I couldn't hear you. I'm sure in spirit you were joining in song, and that's what matters. And now I've lost my little file. Being organised. Okay. My apologies, gang. My other screen has just gone spare on me, which is just what happens when you're trying to be organised about these things. No worries. Kia ora, everyone. So I will just riff as you do, and welcome to this session to discuss the Creative Thinking Pisa results 2022, particularly from an Aotearoa New Zealand perspective. So some of you may have come to this from, we had a session a few weeks back led by glorious Rachel Jacobs, and they talked about the creative thinking results particularly from the Australian perspective. They also did quite well in this Pisa test, and that kind of prompted some conversation and there was a panel there where people talked about those results, and it sort of gave us, the next idea was that we would do our own version here for a New Zealand context to say, how did that relate to us, and to get more further into conversation. One of the things that they did talk about too in that session was potentially it being a little bit more of a fluid kind of panel conversation than two sort of talking heads. So we are going to endeavour to do that today. I better sort of introduce people as well, hadn't I, before we get too far into the thing. So my name is Claire Coleman. I'm the host of the Artsy podcast. I am a general arts education person. My background is drama, particularly creative pedagogy. I'm currently an honorary lecturer at the University of Waikato, and I am working in arts education at the Ministry of Education at the moment. And I'd just like to, before we get too far in, I would like to do the introductions as well. So Professor Stuart McNaughton, would you like to introduce yourself to the group? That you do, yeah.
Kia ora koutou, he nuinga mihi kia koutou. I'm Stuart. I'm a professor at the University of Auckland, colleague of Peter's. I have recently stopped being the Chief Education Scientific Advisor. I've performed in that role, so to speak, hope creatively, over 10 years. And I have, over that period of time, had the privilege of being able to think through the policy implications of the sorts of things that we do, and also the research implications of the sorts of things that policy people do. So great to be here.
Thank you. And Peter.
Oh, ngā mihi nui a koutou, nā rangatira e nā hoki. I do see there's quite a number of friends on that list, including some from our cousins in the West Island over there in Australia. So lovely to see you, John, and others. And Kim, I think, is joining from somewhere in Europe. I too am a professor of education at the University of Auckland and the director of the Centre for Arts and Social Transformation, in and out of classrooms, working using the arts for many, many, many years.
Lovely. Thank you for that, guys. All right. So the plan and the management of the session, the idea is that I'm going to give a very kind of brief overview of the Pisa report and sort of the high-level takeaways from New Zealand, and then I'm going to ask Professor McNaughton to speak, as he was one of the contributors to the report, and share some of his thoughts. And then I'm going to ask Peter to share some of his thoughts about the report and sort of how it relates or doesn't relate to Peter's research in creativity in schools in Aotearoa. And I thought, rather than having hands going and people writing in the chat all at the same time, I thought what we do is, if people can put questions in the chat only, and then we'll work our way through them. And I thought we'd come to you after Stuart speaks, and I'll come to you so you can say your question out loud, because it might have changed in the interim between you writing it and then wanting to say something, and we get to hear from you. But it will also avoid, it gives people a bit of space to think. So that's the plan. I am new to hosting this kind of thing online with all these people, so please bear with me. Hopefully it will go to plan. That is, what we want. So the Program of International Student Assessment, or PISA, is a research program that's initiated through the OECD. They use it to evaluate education systems around the world. They measure ability of 15-year-old students, and it had been maths, reading, and science literacy. And I'm sure you will have been familiar with hearing about those results. And now we have creative thinking. So PISA is quite often held in high esteem in New Zealand and across other developed nations, but they're not universally loved, and it does remain a standardized achievement test. So there are all the kind of issues with design principles and limitations. But in 2022, they assessed for the first time this domain of creative thinking, which reflects a global interest in the cultivation of critical, creative, and innovative skills, and this idea about growth mindsets and adaptable students for our unknown, changeable world. So mainstream schools only in New Zealand were randomly selected to engage in this. There were no students that participated from correspondence schools or kaupapa schools, and across the world there were 500,000 students across 81 countries. They define creative thinking as the competence to engage productively in the generation, evaluation, and improvement of ideas that can result in original and effective solutions, advances in knowledge, and impactful expressions of imagination. It's very much a test that was thinking about creativity with a small c, solving problems, as opposed to what I used to call creativity big C, or sort of a Beyonce level of creativity. So the assessment asked students to generate diverse ideas and creative ideas, and evaluate and improve ideas. It was done individually, it was done on a computer, so it's not dealing in sort of embodied creativity or collaboration or any of those sorts of things. It's kind of a bit on the test itself. High level findings. Aotearoa, New Zealand did quite well in this test and was one of the 4 countries most successful in developing students' capacity to engage in creative thinking. a relatively large proportion of New Zealanders, compared with other countries, were creative thinkers and performed above the baseline. Creative thinking and expressing creative thinking through writing or problem solving was the strength in Aotearoa students, as was generating diverse creative ideas. They didn't do quite as well in scientific problem solving, visual expression, and evaluating and improving other people's ideas. Like everyone in the world, girls outperformed boys in creative thinking. And there was one of the things I think was really interesting about the results here was the sort of relatively high level of socioeconomic disparity in the performance for creative thinking, more so than lots of other similar kind of jurisdictions. There was an idea that there was quite a lot of self-efficacy and an openness to the idea that you could be creative, although half thought that they could. So I don't know, and so you look at that. And they thought there was high levels of pedagogy that promoted their creativity, but low level of participation in creative activities at school. So they saw ways, and I guess were engaged in things they thought were taught in creative ways or engaged in creative ways, but they still was a low level of participation. And students who used digital devices for more than an hour a day tended to do better in those assessments. So that's the whisk through version. I will put a link in the chat to the report for those of you who want to go away and look at that in more detail at some point. But I'll hand over to Stuart now to talk to that, if you wouldn't mind, Stuart.
Kia ora, Claire. Yes, now Claire gave me some framework, which is really time-bound to talk to this report. So I'm only going to make 4 comments really. I'll take as read the measures and their limitations. In other words, I don't want to discuss from my point of view at this point quite how limited they might be and quite what they cover. Maybe Peter will talk to the critique of the measures, so I will leave that to him. The second perhaps caveat before I start is I just take as read also what the OECD claims on good evidence, actually, that the creative thinking, as they define the various competencies, are linked with individual and whānau and collective well-being outcomes. So I just take that as read as well. So my 4 comments are really clear. You already made them. The first is the unequal distribution in the results. The inequalities that are once again laid bare quite starkly by this international comparison. So for us, yes, as Claire says, we have a larger difference than quite a few other countries between those high in material resources and those low in material resources. In fact, the difference means that the index of material resource that they use accounts for about 17% of the outcomes. So once again, now we have to understand why that is the case and quite what that might be related to, because it's proved to be an intractable, widespread in achievement terms problem that our system has faced. But that leads to my second comment, which is why this report is important, even given its limitations, because it directs our attention to thinking about why we might have this as a strength, and then also directs attention to how we might best promote it, whatever it is. So bear with my shorthand here. I'm interested in the detail in the reports, which we don't have time to review in any great detail, but the lack of any really strong relationship with some of their measures of pedagogy in the classrooms, which is true across, in fact, with the wider OECD report, ratings by students, ratings of what they receive. And what's interesting also is a relatively low relationship with particular activities, although the activities read is fairly not quite sure how to refer to the activities, but art classes and debating clubs carry certain sorts of connotations. The third The third comment I would make is I'm really intrigued by the relationship with the digital uses. It's true in the wider OECD report that is quite a generally positive relationship with digital use in classrooms. It's a use, to be technical, it's a U-shaped function, meaning there's a point at which you get better returns, which is around 3 to 4 hours of use daily in classrooms in our data. And there's even a relationship with out of school, at home, recreational, if I can use that term, or leisure as they use in the report, use of the digital devices. And although that's not a U-shaped function, that reaches a ceiling pretty quickly after a few hours. So the digital relationship is interesting. I do know some really detailed and quite robust data on how digital schools that are high frequency digital users are creative. In fact, one set of schools, 100 schools, have a pedagogical framework for their digital pedagogy called Learn, Create and Share. So the create part creates what can be called digital learning objects. Last comment, in our current environment of policy for education and the current foci of education, it is desperately important we celebrate strengths in areas that are broader than, and this is a little bit awkward for me, but given I have a particular interest in literacy, but broader than the usual academic measures of literacy and science and maths. This is really important. Not to say that what we know about creativity is mutually exclusive with those areas at all, but just to say that we are in a context at the minute where a narrowing of a focus is really quite troubling. Anyway, those are my 4 comments for what they're worth, and I'll pass over to Peter.
Oh, kia ora, Stuart, and much of what you've had to say, I concur with absolutely and completely. That I don't think it's useful to traverse the issues of Pisa and its accuracy and those sorts of things, and let's take the report for what it is. I'm interested in the definitions. As a researcher, I spent much of my life looking at what it means to be creative in schools, and I think there are some issues around that maybe some of our listeners might want to pick up. But it's a useful definition, I think, and I can only imagine the difficulty that they must have faced in arriving at something. It's interesting, I think, that what I am interested in, I think, is the meta-narratives, which I often find in PISA reports rather than the detail of rankings. But what else are PISA reports telling us about what works in schools and how they work and so forth? And there's the counter-narrative which is presented in this report, of course, is that despite what the New Zealand Initiative or current ministers might say, New Zealand schools aren't in crisis. That New Zealand schools aren't failing, and nor are teachers. That actually we are one of the best performing education systems in the world. And yes, you're right, Stuart, we should be celebrating that in one area in particular, creative thinking, we are doing extraordinarily well, albeit that's deeply impacted, as it always is in this country, by social inequalities, and that's the caveat that sits across. But yes, this is an opportunity to, and maybe that's why it hasn't had the pickup, because there's a counter narrative to what informs much education policy, that somehow we are in a crisis of our own making as educators because we can't be trusted as professionals, or whatever the reasons might be. That actually we do, as educators, a pretty damn good job for the vast majority of kids. And the vast majority of kids in this country are enjoying their time at school. It's a place where they are, despite all the constraints, despite everything, feel that they can take risks with their learning, that they can engage in creative pursuits with their teachers and are supported in doing that. And that's a narrative that we who are involved, especially in the arts, should be celebrating. The question that you raised, I think, is a really interesting one, which is why is it that in fact, I'm sorry, I'll just peel it back. I had significant physiotherapy this afternoon. I think it's affected my brain a bit. So I just sort of throw that in as another caveat. One of the interesting lines I thought from in the report says that good performance in creativity is closely linked to good performance in reading and maths. And that has failed to be picked up in government policy or Ministry of Education professional development. And it's always been presented as a binary. We either focus on creative pursuits or we go down a focus on academic subjects, and in particular, and that's now being turned into structured approaches to literacy, or it shifts into direct instruction, and it's always presented as a binary. But Pisa is very clear in that creativity can be taught, it can be assessed, and it's not just the purview of the arts, that one would expect creativity in maths and in science and technology and all the areas. So this, especially you talk about the policy narrowing of the curriculum, but beyond that, I think there's this false choice which is being presented, which is knowledge on one end, skills on the other, and somehow they don't come together. There's creative approaches to learning, or you have teachers standing at the front of the room imparting knowledge. But any of us who've been involved in education for our lives, which is everybody probably on this panel and listening in, knows learning's not a science, teaching's not a science. It's messy business. And it's messy business because it's the business of how knowledge and skills come together so that children can imagine and reimagine their lives differently. So I think that's, I really want to say that. The other thing is that we know, those of us who've been involved in arts education for years, know why children who perform well in the arts do well in literacy and numeracy. And we know why children who do well in the arts are more likely to be found in wealthier schools. So the interesting work that Alistair Martin did when he looked, for example, at the impact of extracurricular arts on students' achievement, the correlation was very clear. Children who have access to dance, drama, music, and the visual arts do better at school. If you look at the work that Brian Cardwell did in Australia, that extraordinary piece of research where he looked at the 50 top performing schools in Australia and asked, what do they have in common? What is the thing that they have in common? And as a former dean of the Faculty of Education at Melbourne, not an arts educator, he said, the one thing they have in common is that they're arts-rich schools. And one of the things that we know in this country is that access to the arts is dependent on wealth, and it's particularly true in schools. And so we get that. The other thing that I would say is that the research is really clear that, especially in terms of literacy, children who are exposed to drama pedagogy and creative approaches do better in inferential comprehension at levels which are quite extraordinary, and that's backed up by the DICE research and 20 countries across Europe. And one of the things that really strikes me is that the issue that we face in this country in terms of literacy is not about decoding, but the issue is around inferential comprehension, how you engage in the subtext. So those kinds of creative pedagogies are really important. We know that kids who do well in dance and music do better at numeracy. It makes sense, doesn't it? Patterning, rhythm, all those kinds of things which are embodied learning. We know that kids who do well in the visual arts do extraordinarily well in those mathematical concepts around shape perspective, all those kinds of things. And finally, what I'd say, which kind of links into your comment about mental health, we know children who are excited by the arts at school, and this is the work that was done by Alistair Martin in Australia, and is really, I think, important work, is that there's a link between motivation, engagement, and creative pedagogies. And there's a link between engagement, motivation, and success at school. So, I'm very excited by this report. I think it says a lot of the things that we've known. It's a signpost in many ways that maybe it's about time that if governments really want to make the difference in those core areas of literacy and numeracy, they might begin to look at creativity a little bit more closely.
Can I just jump in to add and ask you, Peter, if you could just expand on for our listeners and our viewers, how this relates to your own research that you did, that creative report a few years ago, and just whether, I'm just thinking about what resonances that has with the work that you did, what could be brought out from that work that would potentially, could dovetail into some of this Pisa finding.
I think one of the things that maybe I should speak to the motivation for doing that work, which was to develop a way of beginning to understand what makes a creative environment in schools. And part of that was to demystify or to demythologize what we understand as creativity in classrooms. I did an interview yesterday where someone said, is that about kids running around doing what the hell they like? And I said, yep, no, right. It's not. It's not. In fact, at the heart of the arts, for example, or at the heart of any creative endeavor is disciplinary knowledge. You can't be creative just by picking up a paintbrush and flinging paint around. You can at one. You can't. You actually need to know how to hold a brush. There's a whole range of disciplinary knowledge and skills which are inherent in those kinds of practices. So it was about attempting to grab hold of something which is really nebulous. And Pisa has attempted to do the same as well with this report. We all say creativity is really important, but what the hell does that mean? What does it look like? What does it look like for a teacher? What does it feel like for a kid in a classroom? And that's what really motivated our work, so that we could begin to think about what are the pedagogical and curriculum practices that create a situation where children can engage creatively with their learning, reckoning that if we could work that out and draw a link across to achievement, we might begin to seriously impact on what's happening. Stuart's talking about Manaia Kalani with I don't know if you're supposed to mention the name, Stuart, but as a classic example of creative knowledge-based skill in working hand in hand, and seeing the kinds of shifts which happened. The importance of children feeling motivated, engaged in their learning, and the impact of that. And what worries me, of course, with the narrowing of the curriculum, if we're having teachers standing at the front of rooms believing that direct instruction and structured literacy is going to engage kids, I think we're dreaming.
I can see we have a question from Celia. So Celia, I'm just going to unmute and such so that you can ask that question aloud to whomever it's intended for. Let me just find you on my, there we go. I am unmuting you. And
thank you, Claire.
No worries.
Very, very interesting. Formally, I am a Waikato PhD student here in New Zealand. I've lived here for a while, but also I'm Uruguayan from South America. I run a nonprofit there, so I've been in the public sector. This is very interesting. So my question relies on what you were discussing about the relationship between math and literacy with other the percentage of the variation in performance, it's due to other factors. And the percentage is pretty high, 70%. So my question was, or is, if these other factors have been identified by other research, meaning, I don't know, well-being or cost of living, I don't know, or if for you these other factors relate, as you were mentioning, Peter, about motivation and engagement or relationship with the teachers. So leave it to you.
Peter, do you want to go first?
I'll defer to you, Stuart.
Okay. I'd be keen to, Cecilia, it seems to me from your comment and what you've just said that you probably have thought about this. Now, I'm not going to do the trick of saying, so what do you think the answer is? So what I think is that there are a set of competencies, as the OECD describes this, of course, that function separately or additionally to literacy and maths. I think they are to do with engagement and motivation, but I do think there's a part of it which is uniquely to do with practice effects. That is the degree to which you've engaged in creative enterprises, and these transfer or are generalizable to novel or new contexts. I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know some things about, from a learning science perspective, to do with transfer and generalization, and I suspect there's quite a strong practice effect here. And that begs the question, what is it that our students are practicing? What are our students doing? And before I lose my thread, Peter, although I don't have physiotherapy to blame, I just have state of the world perhaps to blame, but I want to underline what Peter said, and that is to celebrate the professional skill and expertise of our teachers here. In fact, I've just been writing something that argues that the very quote unquote looseness in our curriculum that teachers adapt in expert ways is creative acts, and we should see teachers' professionalism as a form of creativity, given the way that we approach the nature of teaching in New Zealand. Cecilia, I've gone off script, but that's my response. Peter?
I think you've covered it all there, Stuart. I was thinking about our teachers, and Clarence Beebe once said, educational reform takes 30 years to embed. And one of the things that we've done is we've flicked from, because of the electoral cycle and the swings from one thing to the other. But maybe one of the things which has stayed in the New Zealand education system is the vestiges of that progressive education system, especially in our primary schools, which really, despite the imposition of national standards and a whole range of other things, kind of still sets out and aside and apart New Zealand education. I remember when I trained as a teacher over 40 years ago, my lecturer at the Auckland College of Education in those days said in despair, well, the bloody thing is you'll all end up teaching like you were taught anyway. And we all know it's the bane of all education policy people as they try and make changes that actually sustains. And the culture of the New Zealand classroom is something unique because of 1937 and the kinds of reforms that then flowed through, and the kind of, although there were, a consensus which lasted for generations, and there's something, I've never really been able to quite put my finger on it, but there is something distinct. And it's not just because of the bicultural heritage of this country and the particular demographics, but because of our educational history. There is something quite unique, I think, especially about our primary classrooms.
Thank you for that, Peter and Stuart. I'm just
Thank you.
but I hope that answered your question, Cecilia. I saw that So also put a comment in. I wanted to wonder if you wanted to talk to that, taking us kind of in a slightly different tangent to creativity in the science space. I'm just going to find you and unmute you so you can make that comment. And as I said, anyone else who has a comment or would like to ask a question, please pop yourself in the chat and I will make you live. Sabrina, are you there?
Yeah, I am, thank you. Yeah, it was more a comment really, a bit of shock. Creativity is essential to science, so it is worrying to see, and not surprising, but worrying to see that that result in Pisa, and it sits alongside the results from the Pisa science, where our students, when our students are engaged in science as a process and hands-on and engaged in practical science, it's a follow the, paint by numbers, follow the recipe. So this triangulates, I guess, the findings from the science Pisa as well, which gives us cause to think about how we can address that, because that's not what leads to good science thinking in terms of a science discipline, people understanding how science discipline works, or people who are going to be students, I'm thinking about, who are going to be in science as a discipline. It doesn't serve either of those well. How we get about that, we've got some ideas, but I think science is one of those learning areas that there's a lot of traditional gate holding and tradition holding. And I think until we break down those barriers, we won't see science education producing students who are going into science or not going into science, understanding how important creativity in science is. That's my 2 cents anyway. Any thoughts on how we get around that would be greatly appreciated.
Sabrina, can I ask you a question that relates to your comment? In the science literacy Pisa work and some of the other reports that the OECD has produced, they find a negative relationship between the amount of inquiry in science that students report and achievement in science. And I've thought long and hard about that, and it sort of relates to a comment that Peter made about our focus on coming from the New Zealand initiative on knowledge and others. And I'm wondering, and I hate to use this term, but maybe there's an issue to do with balance here, because Peter also said that you can't think creatively, and you certainly can't do things that we might refer to as metacognitive unless you've got something to think about or something to be creative with. It just seems to me a nonsense. So I do wonder whether some of what we do in inquiry is relatively surface and vacuous. And
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that's the direction I probably would look, and that might relate to the confidence that students have in the thinking of many good ideas. It might be content related more than process related, or knowledge, if you like, for content.
I think we have a problem where a lot of teachers and people see inquiry as a dichotomy to direct instruction or support by the teacher. And so I wonder how much our students have been engaged when they're engaged in inquiry is just open slather, which, with no support from a teacher and expecting students to, inquire on their own. And when it's complete open slather, of course, they're not going to understand the concepts behind what they're looking at.
This goes back to Peter's earlier comment about being the suggestion that creativity was just, run around and do whatever you like, and about kind of, and maybe that's part of what this bringing attention to this Pisa result and this kind of conversation can do, is highlight what is creativity, what are the things that you need to think about, what are the, how do you facilitate for those things so that it's understood at a more nuanced level, and then how it applies across learning areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's been and I don't know if it's deliberate, but it sometimes feels a very deliberate creation of a binary between skills and knowledge, academic subjects, creative approaches, inquiry methods, direct instructions. And again, I think, it is that balanced approach. And in fact, it was part of this whole nonsense that classrooms should be student-centered. Of course, they're not student-centered or teacher-student. They're centered around the interaction between teachers and students. All the research tells us that. Quality learning happens because of the interaction between teachers and students. And teachers come into rooms with knowledge and skills that children don't have. And it's around the way in which they create opportunities and spaces for that to do it. It's not about teachers just being facilitators or being instructors. It's about teachers being all of those things, of having all of those capacities, of doing all of that. It's an all. It's not an either or. And I get so discouraged when it's simplified into teaching is not a technical skill. It's not a craft. It's something that takes years and years of practice to hone into something that's really powerful. Our young ones can do it, but it takes years to build a successful teaching career. And that's because it's not these simple recipes. This nonsense that we're going to fix literacy and numeracy now with structured literacy, it's just a nonsense. It's actually about how you take the best of everything and give that into the hands of our teachers so that they can make the difference. That's me.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to zigzag over to Laurie, who has a comment here around the role of free play in creativity, and I think that is actually quite a nice zag in terms of, again, some of the misunderstanding around what free play involves and its relationship to creativity. So, Laurie, I'm coming to you. Hopefully that's working. She said, hopefully. Laurie, are you with me? Oh, perchance I've lost Laurie. Are you there? Okay. Unless Laurie would like to. Oh, we've got clapping and applause for Laurie, but we still can't find Laurie, I'm afraid. Join us, please. Okay, in the interim, is there anyone else who would like to pop in with a question or a comment? Oh, yes. Oh, bye, Gaynor. Oh, I've lost my momentum now. Laurie's in there and then she's gotten knocked out. Okay, well, I'll ask Peter and Stuart to talk about it in lieu of Laurie, and hope she comes back. Just asking around the place of free play in developing creativity and I guess play-based learning. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Oh, I have many thoughts around play-based learning, and I don't know if this is the place to begin that debate. I think I think a lot of the practice which we call play-based learning is not necessarily based in play, or my understandings of play. If play means being playful with ideas, if playful means having a sense of enjoyment, not fun, then play is important in classrooms. We know that being able to play with your teacher, and by that have a playful relationship, is really important. So if you look at some of the work that's been done around teacher-student relationship, play is actually really important because it establishes a more human relationship, not a friendship relationship, but a more human relationship between students and teachers in classrooms. One of the things about play, and Elliot Eisner writes about it, and why I think it's so important in classrooms, and he writes about it in terms of flexible purposing. One of the things that we do differently in the arts, I think, to other parts of the curriculum, is that we often begin without knowing where we might end. that actually the learning outcomes arrive out of the chaos of the work that we do. And that's, if you've ever written a poem, if you've ever sung a song, if you've ever played on a guitar, you might start with an intention, but you end up somewhere else because you're playing with structure and function and form and content, and you arrive somewhere else. And that's very tricky in a system which centres around learning objectives and learning outcomes, whereas in the arts, anyone who's ever engaged in the arts knows it's not linear. And play isn't linear at one level. That, in fact, play is, Elliot Eisner says one of the things that the arts teach us to do is to traffic in subtleties and to play with ambiguities. And that's vitally important for us as humans, because we live in ambiguous times, and times where the subtleties of good and bad are hard for us to discern. So yes, I'm a great believer in the place and role of play. Sometimes I see it traduced into notions of kids kind of choosing exactly what they want to learn, when they want to learn it, and how they want to learn it. I don't believe that's what play in a classroom is about. If it's this other idea, which is sometimes we might begin things without knowing where we might end, and that might be a counter to the way in which much of classrooms are structured, it's really useful. I often start work, even at the university, with my, when I'm teaching the arts, and I give a provocation and I have no idea where it might end, but I know because of my skills as a teacher, because I can ask really useful questions, I have a rich body of knowledge that I can use to shift and move the learning along, that I can be playful in my classrooms. And I think that's really important. It's very different to structured, but is it not structured? Direct instruction. Direct instruction never felt to me particularly playful, and it's not.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Peter's. But a couple of Peter's comments, but a couple of quick, somewhat tangential thoughts. One is about Rousseau and the Emile. It's if you read the Emile and the romantic view of letting kids do what they will and will learn, you'll quickly realize that Rousseau was very much into structuring what the Emile learned in very deliberate ways. So there's that comment. And the second one is, it relates to what I said about inquiry. So I just agree with what Peter said. In fact, sometimes play is hard work, and sometimes teachers need to be able to, I hesitate to use the word structure, but organize circumstances and conditions so that play is productive in some ways. I worry about some of the very superficial readings of what play might be and free play. Laurie, I think it would be great if I could see you. Then I would know I'm talking to the Laurie who I thought I knew.
I think you supervised his PhD, didn't you, Stuart?
Well, no, not directly, but in fact, Laurie was principal at the school that my grandfather established in Aotearoa.
Oh, my wife taught there as well.
Great school.
Great school.
Isn't that very much an Aotearoa New Zealand comment, right?
Yes, all there, all relational.
So here's my next thought, and I see we've got some more comments into the chat, but if people do want to ask a question more than just a comment, and please sing out in there. I guess going back to where we started this conversation around the creative, and that one of the comments that I made in the panel, or maybe I just thought it last time, was the fact that of the top countries in the creative thinking, we're the only one with no creativity strategy. And so in terms of what we, if you looked at this result in 22 and thought, well, it's evidence that actually things are, as Peter said, still bubbling along, and particularly in primary classrooms, kids are still managing to have creative experiences. What are the things we need to do to sustain that, and to ensure that, it's not a sort of fluke result, or that it isn't eclipsed by other concerns?
Well, it's something that Claire, something that you said a moment or two ago is really important. That is for us to better understand the nature of and the expression of creativity across the learning areas. I was thinking as you were making that comment of a professor, I think is at Cambridge, who has the wonderful title of Professor of Forensic Statistics. And Spiegelhalter celebrated, thought our curriculum into secondary as well. So I don't want to leave secondary behind in this conversation. Mm-hmm. In statistics was the best in the world, and the reason he identified our statistics teaching, at least in terms of the curriculum description, as the best in the world was just because it was focused on problem solving and creative thinking. And I think there's quite an important, I see it as a research task, but it might be more of a curriculum specialist sort of policy task, and that is to increase our awareness of the presence and, as I say, the expression of creativity across the learning areas, and how that contributes to, as we've already traversed, the outcomes that we all value.
And maybe it's picking up on, I just see my friend Dagmar commenting that much of this is around the relationships which teachers have with children. You know, one of the things that's so important around creativity for children is being a creative human being in a classroom, being creative yourself and feeling that you have the freedom to be creative, to take risks in classrooms, to be playful, to do all those kinds of things. And really good teachers are teachers who, in my mind anyway, fill their creative souls. They paint, they draw, they write, they go to the movies, they sing, they do all those kinds of things, and it really richly feeds into classrooms. In all sorts of different ways, and you know, teaching is such a joy because you create powerful relationships with people, with your colleagues. You know, playful staff rooms are vital. You know, one of the beauties too, I think, of, you know, Stuart and I have just moved into a gorgeous, glorious new building on the campus at the University of Auckland, and you can't help but be inspired by the art on the walls and the sculptures. And we've got Lisa Reihana in the foyer, and there's something about that physical environment that seems to be so important as well. I remember going into the new building in November and thinking, oh, it looks wonderful. And now it's alive. And what brought it alive was other people's creativity. It's just wonderful. And being surrounded by other people's creativity is so life-giving for teachers and principals, you know, and for children.
I think that comments back to what Stuart was saying about the professionalism of teachers as well, in terms of that's an important element, right? That what the teacher is bringing and those aspects of themselves and their interest in the arts, and communicating and sharing that in their classrooms, which is another way that we can ensure creative approaches go on. I've got Juliet has got a question which has got lots of love and thumbs up, so I'm going to go to Juliet so she can ask her question out loud, if I can get it to work this time. If not, I will read it. Juliet is also silent. Oh, maybe this is a settings thing. Oh, I thought I was doing so well. Okay, I will read you Juliet's question. My apologies, Juliet.
Hold on, can you hear me now?
There you go. There you are.
I just got a little message to do some weird thing, and I did it.
Grand.
Kia ora. I can't find my question. What did I say?
You said practical advice.
Yeah. Okay. What can a teacher listening here do tomorrow that will help them and their team, and perhaps convince their SLT to to engage in a more creative approach? One piece of practical advice.
If you're not,
You go,
Go,
Peter.
Stuart.
Yeah, you go.
If you're not already a member of a subject association which is advocating on these exact issues, join the Aotearoa Educators Collective, which is working really hard as well to be a voice which presents a counter based on the evidence. You know, one of the things that strikes me is, you know, a teacher in the school advocating on behalf. It's, you know, I've been there. It's a hell of a thing, but advocating together, challenging the kinds of things which are, you know, when Stuart's talking about the narrowing of the curriculum, of people not making these links across, of doing all of that kind of stuff, it's part of our duty as critical pedagogues. There you go, an old-fashioned term, but you know, it's probably a useful one in these times.
Yeah.
And I see Stuart's put some great stuff up as well.
Yeah.
Well, all that I would add at this point is look to the strengths within the school. I think that on this evidence, actually, we have quite a lot of capability across the system for thinking about creativity and from promoting it. And maybe it's like Whitehead said, perhaps inert until we talk about it and discuss collectively in our workplace. And but I would, as I've said in the chat, I would, given these times, really make a point about us knowing the evidence. Peter's reviewed some of that, and it sounds a little bit transactional or sort of over the top, but really we have to be able to talk to those who make decisions around what it is we know and what it is we know well.
Yeah, brilliant.
Get chatty is it's my 2 words summary of that. Get chatty, I think. Yeah. Get chatty. Just ask a question. Oh, did you hear about this? You know, just start seeding it in your staff room with whomever and seeing where it takes you. I can see lots of people. I put something in the chat.
I love what Robin Sutton has said there.
Yeah, and I think that's again where I think this conversation needs to carry on in terms of, as I say, coming, you know, coalescing around a real response to this Pisa result and what that could mean in terms of an acknowledgement of the place of creativity that is so far absent in education policies and such here, and pushing that a little bit more and making some noise. On that note, there will be an upcoming blog on the NZARI link that's particularly around this, just to again raise a bit more conversation amongst teachers on the Aotearoa NZARI blog. So you can keep an eye out for that if you're wanting a physical piece of paper to take to your teachers or to teach to your principals that gives a kind of summary overview of this. And some links to some more of this content that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, so you can keep an eye out for that. And I think, yeah, we'll have to see where this next conversation will take us, but I am conscious that it's 7 o'clock and we've exhausted our poor guests with their various physio ailments. So maybe it's time for do you want to have a last parting thought? Stuart, I'll go with you first because Peter needs to think how to.
No, I'm all out of creativity. No. Let me say it is a pleasure always, and this is a serious comment, to engage in serious and playful conversations that are professionally focused as this one is. So thank you, everyone. I've learned from this.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Stuart, for your wonderful time. Peter.
Yeah, I'm actually heading off to MC a poetry night at a pizza bar. So I'm taking my aching body down to have a glass of wine and a piece of pizza and listen to some poems. So that'll refresh me.
Anyone wants to join you? Where should they go?
My love to everybody. I've got to go and pick my poems up off the printer now.
All right, well, there we go. That's the thing. You've got to live and breathe. You've got to do with the mahi as well as talk about it. So, we should all go off now and engage in some creative pursuits ourselves.